After decades of doing this, I've learned one fundamental truth that applies to every single person who walks onto my stage. Reality is often just the story we tell ourselves so we can survive the day. We all have our versions of the truth, our own little narratives that help us make sense of a world that can be chaotic, cold, and unforgiving. But every once in a while, I come across a case where that narrative has drifted so far from the shore of objective reality that the person is essentially living on an island of one. That's where I met Marcus. He's 42 years old, and for the last 5 years, he hasn't been living in the same world as you and me. He's been living in a world of frequencies, cosmic alignments, and what he firmly believes are direct communications from an extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, most people hear that and they want to laugh, or they want to look away, or they want to slap a label on him and call it a day. But I've never been interested in labels. Labels are for file folders. I'm interested in the why. Why does a grown man, a former architectural drafter with a sharp mind and a history of professional success, decide that the hum of a refrigerator is a coded message from the Pleiades? When Marcus first sat down in my office, before the cameras were even rolling, I saw a man who was vibrating with a kind of nervous energy that I've seen 1,000 times before. It's the energy of someone who is desperate to be understood but terrified of being judged. He didn't look like the stereotypical crazy person you see in the movies. He was dressed neatly, his hair was combed, and he spoke with a deliberate intellectual cadence. But his eyes, they were searching. They were looking for a sign that I was going to be another person who told him he was broken. His sister, Sarah, was the one who reached out to us. She was at the end of her rope. She told me, "Phil, I've lost my brother. He's physically there, but he's gone. He's spent his entire inheritance on equipment to bridge the gap," as he calls it. He doesn't hold a job. He doesn't date, and he's alienated every friend he ever had because he can't talk about anything else. She wasn't angry. She was grieving. And that's a distinction I always look for. Anger is a defensive emotion, but grief is about love. She loved the man he used to be, and she was terrified that the man he had become was slipping into a void where she couldn't reach him. I spent a lot of time reviewing the footage of Marcus at home before he came to Los Angeles. I saw a basement filled with monitors, copper wiring draped over the ceiling like some kind of metallic spider web, and notebooks, hundreds of notebooks filled with what looked like mathematical equations mixed with sketches of star charts. To the casual observer, it's madness. But when I look at those notebooks, I don't see madness. I see a man trying to solve a problem. I see a man trying to find order in his life. Marcus told me that the transmissions started shortly after his father passed away. Now, in my line of work, we call that a triggering event. You don't just wake up one day and decide you're an intergalactic radio receiver. Something happens that makes the real world too painful to inhabit, so the mind builds a back door. It builds a way out. His father was his anchor, the only person who truly understood his eccentricities and his passion for science. When that anchor was pulled up, Marcus started drifting. The problem, as I saw it, wasn't just the aliens. The problem was the isolation. We are social animals. We need connection like we need oxygen. If we don't get it from the people around us, our brains will start to manufacture it. For Marcus, the aliens weren't just beings from another planet. They were his new social circle. They were the ones who finally saw him. They were the ones who gave him a purpose that felt bigger than his grief. When he explained it to me, he didn't sound like he was reciting a sci-fi script. He sounded like a man who had finally found a friend. He said, "Dr. Phil, they don't care about my mistakes. They don't care that I lost my job or that I'm 42 and single. They care about what I can learn. They're teaching me things." And when he said that, I realized that for the last 5 years, everyone in Marcus's life had been telling him he was wrong. His sister told him he was wrong. His doctors told him he was wrong. The internet trolls he argued with told him he was wrong. And what does a man do when the whole world tells him he's wrong? He digs his heels in. He builds a wall. He stops listening to anyone who doesn't validate his reality. I knew that if I walked into that room and started telling Marcus he was delusional, I'd lose him in the first 30 seconds. You can't argue someone out of a belief system that is keeping them emotionally afloat. It's like trying to talk someone into jumping off a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean because you don't like the color of the boat. He's not going to jump until he knows there's a shore he can swim to. So my goal wasn't to debunk the aliens. My goal was to find the man underneath the copper wires and the star charts. I had to understand the function of the belief. In every behavior, there is a payoff. People don't do things for no reason. They do them because they get something out of it. Marcus was getting a sense of significance. He was getting a sense of belonging. He was getting a reason to get out of bed in the morning. If I wanted to help him, I had to find a way to give him those things in the real world without the need for an extraterrestrial bypass. Sarah sat on the stage next to him, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. She was leaning away from him, her body language screaming frustration. She had spent years trying to use logic to fight an emotional fire. She'd bring him scientific papers. She'd point out that no one else heard the hum. She'd plead with him to just be normal. And every time she did that, she was just another person who didn't believe him. Marcus sat there with his arms crossed, his jaw set. He was prepared for a fight. He expected me to be the ultimate authority figure who would come down on him with a hammer and tell him he was crazy. But I don't use that word. It's a lazy word. It's a word people use when they don't want to do the work of understanding the human condition. I looked at Marcus and I didn't see a crazy man. I saw a lonely man. I saw a man who was so smart that he had managed to intellectualize his loneliness into a cosmic mystery. He had turned his isolation into an elite club where he was the only member and everyone else was just too close-minded to understand. It's a very sophisticated defense mechanism. It's a way of saying, I'm not failing at life, I'm succeeding at something you can't even comprehend. As we started talking, I could see him testing me. He had used technical jargon, talking about quantum entanglement and nonlinear temporal shifts. He was trying to see if I could keep up or if I'd just dismiss him. I've dealt with some of the most brilliant minds in the country, and I've also dealt with people who are completely untethered. Marcus was a bit of both. He had the intellect to weave a very convincing web, but he lacked the emotional grounding to see where the web ended and he began. I told him, Marcus, I'm not here to tell you what you do or don't hear. I'm not in your head, but I am here to look at the results of your life. Because at the end of the day, that's the only metric that matters. I asked him, how's this working for you? That's my favorite question, because it cuts through the theory and gets to the heart of the matter. How is believing in these transmissions working for your relationship with your sister? How is it working for your bank account? How is it working for your peace of mind? He didn't have an answer for that. He tried to pivot back to the importance of the messages, but I kept him right there in the reality of his own existence. I pointed out that he was 42, living in a basement with a sister who was crying herself to sleep every night because she missed him. I told him, you can be the most important person in the galaxy, but if you're failing the people who love you right here on earth, then you're failing, period. It was a hard truth, and I could see it land. For the first time, the cosmic facade cracked just a little bit. He didn't get angry, he got quiet. And in that silence, I saw the little boy who had lost his father and didn't know how to navigate a world that felt too big and too loud. That's the moment the real work begins. That's the moment we stop talking about aliens and start talking about Marcus. You have to understand where a man like Marcus comes from to understand how he ended up in a basement listening to static. He wasn't born believing in star people. He was born into a world of blueprints and structural integrity. His father was an old school structural engineer, a man who believed that if you couldn't measure it, it didn't exist. Marcus grew up in that environment, a world where everything had a place and every force had a counterforce. He was a brilliant kid, the kind who could take a clock apart and put it back together before he was 10. But he was also a kid who didn't quite fit in with the other kids on the playground. He was the professor, the one who would rather talk about the physics of a swing set than actually swing on it. His father was the only one who didn't try to change him. His father saw that analytical mind as a gift, not a burden. They shared a private language of mathematics and design. When Marcus went into architectural drafting, it wasn't just a career choice. It was a way to stay connected to his father's world. But then, 5 years ago, his father passed away quite suddenly. A heart attack at the dinner table. Just like that, the man who had been Marcus's bridge to the rest of the world was gone. And Marcus didn't know how to grieve. He didn't have the emotional tools to deal with a loss that wasn't logical. You can't calculate the why of a heart attack. You can't draft a blueprint for a broken heart. So his brain did what high-functioning analytical brains often do when they're overwhelmed. It started looking for a pattern. It started looking for a reason why the world suddenly felt so empty and silent. About 6 months after the funeral, Marcus was sitting in his living room, and he started hearing what he described as a low-frequency hum. Now, we've all heard it. The refrigerator, the AC, the distant sound of traffic. But to Marcus, this wasn't background noise. This was a signal. He started to believe that the silence his father left behind was actually being filled with something else. At first, he told Sarah about it as if it were a scientific curiosity. He'd say, "Sarah, do you hear that pitch? It's consistent, it's rhythmic." She'd shrug it off, tell him it was just the old pipes in the house. But Marcus couldn't let it go. He bought his first piece of specialized equipment, a high-end digital recorder, to try and capture it. When he played back the white noise and heard nothing but static, he didn't conclude that there was nothing there. He concluded that his equipment wasn't sensitive enough. That is the moment the slide began. That's the moment when searching for answers turned into an obsession. He wasn't just a grieving son anymore. He was a researcher on the verge of a breakthrough. And that gave him a rush of dopamine that the real world just couldn't provide. It gave him a sense of mission. As the months turned into years, the research took over his life. He started missing work because he'd stayed up all night monitoring frequencies. He'd show up to meetings looking disheveled, talking about signal degradation and non-terrestrial interference. His firm was patient for a long time. They valued his talent, but eventually, you can't have a guy designing skyscrapers who thinks the HVAC system is trying to tell him about the future of humanity. They let him go. And instead of that being a wake-up call, Marcus saw it as a liberation. He told Sarah, "They're holding me back. They don't want me to see what I'm seeing." He took his severance pay, his savings, and eventually his inheritance from their father, and he turned his home into a laboratory. I looked at the photos Sarah brought of his lab. It was heartbreaking, really. Thousands of dollars worth of oscilloscopes, spectrum analyzers, and custom-built antenna. He had foil over the windows because he claimed external light pollution was messing with his readings. He was living on protein shakes and coffee, barely sleeping, his weight dropping. Sarah tried everything. She brought in a local priest. She brought in a psychologist. She even tried to stage a logic intervention where she brought in one of their father's old colleagues to explain the physics of radio waves. But Marcus had an answer for everything. He'd become a master of confirmation bias. He'd take any random piece of data, a flickering light, a dropped call, a weird dream, and he'd weave it into his grand theory. He wasn't just hearing aliens, he was convinced they were choosing him because of his architectural understanding of the universe. He believed he was being recruited to help them build something. The escalation reached a breaking point about 3 months before they came to the show. Marcus had stopped answering Sarah's calls. When she finally used her spare key to get into his house, she found him in the basement, sitting in the dark, surrounded by the glow of a dozen monitors. He hadn't showered in a week. He told her, "Sarah, stay back. The frequency is unstable today. If you get too close, you'll disrupt the connection." She looked at him, her brother, a man who used to be her best friend, and she saw a stranger. She saw someone who was physically there but mentally a million miles away. She told him she was going to call the police to have him committed for a psychiatric evaluation. Marcus didn't get scared. He got cold. He looked at her and said, "If you do that, you're choosing to be part of the problem. You're choosing to stay in the dark. I'm trying to save us, and you're trying to lock me in a cage." That's the us versus them mentality that makes these situations so dangerous. Marcus had created a world where anyone who questioned him was an adversary, even his own sister. Sarah realized that she couldn't fight this alone. She saw a clip of a previous show I'd done on delusional disorders, and she reached out. She told my producers, "I don't care if you tell him he's wrong. I just want him to come back to earth. I want my brother back." And Marcus, interestingly enough, agreed to come because he saw me as a platform. He thought, finally, someone with a big enough audience will listen to my evidence. He wasn't coming to get help. He was coming to give a lecture. He was coming to reveal the truth to the world. When they got to the studio, the tension was palpable. Marcus wouldn't even sit in the same dressing room as Sarah. He told my staff that her negative energy was interfering with his ability to stay aligned. He was carrying a briefcase full of data printouts of static, scribbled notes, and what he claimed were blueprints for a cosmic gate. He was ready for a debate. But I knew that a debate was the last thing he needed. You don't debate a man who is drowning, you throw him a rope. The problem was, Marcus didn't believe he was drowning. He believed he was the only one who had learned how to breathe underwater. I sat down with Sarah first, alone, to get the full picture of the damage. She told me about the debt. He had blown through nearly $200,000. He defaulted on his mortgage. He was weeks away from being homeless, and he didn't even care. He told her the aliens would provide for him once the gate was open. It's a classic case of what I call catastrophic displacement. The real world had become so scary, the loss of his father, the loss of his career, the impending loss of his home, that he had to displace all that anxiety into a fantasy world where he was the hero, not the victim. In his mind, he wasn't a 42-year-old unemployed man losing his house. He was a chosen messenger for an advanced civilization. Which one of those realities would you rather live in? If you're Marcus, the choice is easy, but the cost was his life. I walked onto that stage knowing I had to bridge a gap that was wider than any I'd seen in a long time. I had to respect his intellect while challenging his reality. I had to be the structural engineer of his psyche, looking for the cracks in his foundation before the whole building came down. I looked at him, sitting there with his briefcase held tight to his chest like a shield, and I thought, okay, Marcus, let's see if we can find the signal through all this noise. I started by asking him about his father. I didn't ask about the aliens. I didn't ask about the frequencies. I asked him, tell me about the man who taught you how to build things. And for a second, just a split second, the messenger vanished and the grieving son came back. His eyes softened. He started talking about the blueprints they used to study together. That was my way in. That was the real frequency I needed to tune into. I watched Marcus as he talked about his father. His voice changed. It lost that metallic, rehearsed quality it had when he was reciting quantum theories, and it became softer, more rhythmic, almost like a child's. He told me about how they used to sit in the garage for hours, his father teaching him how to read a level, how to calculate load-bearing weights, how to respect the integrity of a structure. His father used to tell him, Marcus, if the foundation isn't right, nothing else matters. You can build the most beautiful house in the world, but if the dirt underneath it is soft, it's all coming down. I leaned in then, because that was the most profound thing he'd said all day. I told him, Marcus, that's exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about your foundation, and right now, buddy, your foundation is turning into quicksand. He didn't like that. He immediately reached for his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. This was his proof. He laid out a schematic on the coffee table between us, and I'll tell you, it was impressive in its complexity. It was a dense, intricate drawing of what looked like a circular craft covered in thousands of tiny, precise annotations. He pointed to a section and said, Dr. Phil, look at the geometry here. This isn't human. No architectural firm on this planet uses these ratios. This was transmitted to me over a period of 6 weeks. I saw Sarah's face crumble. She leaned forward, her voice trembling, and she said, Marcus, those are the blueprints for the suspension bridge Dad worked on in '98. I found the original rolls in the attic last year. You've just drawn over them. You've added these symbols and these lines, but it's Dad's work. You're literally drawing on top of his memory. The silence in the studio was heavy. You could hear a pin drop. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the drawings. He just looked at me and said, she doesn't understand the concept of layering. They use our existing structures as a template. It's a way to bridge the communication gap. They're taking what I know, what Dad taught me, and they're upgrading it. I looked at the drawings again. Sarah was right. Underneath the chaotic alien scribbles, I could see the steady, professional hand of an old-school engineer. It was heartbreaking. It was a visual representation of a man's mind being overwritten by a delusion. He was taking his father's legacy, the very thing that gave him his identity, and he was burying it under a fantasy. I decided it was time to get real with him about the cost of this mission. I said, Marcus, let's talk about the math. You're a numbers guy. Let's look at the ledger of your life. You've spent $200,000 of your father's hard-earned money. You're about to lose the house he left you. You haven't had a paycheck in 3 years. Your sister, the only person left who truly gives a damn about you, is sitting here crying because she feels like her brother is dead. Now you tell me, if these advanced beings are so smart and they've chosen you to be their representative on earth, why are they letting you rot? Why are they letting you become a penniless, isolated man living in a basement? If I'm a superior intelligence and I want to send a message to Earth, I'm not going to choose a guy who can't pay his electric bill. I'm going to choose someone who has the resources and the credibility to get the job done. Don't you think you're being a little bit used by these entities? He blinked, and for a second, I thought I saw a flash of anger. That's good. Anger is better than apathy. Anger means you're still in the fight. He said, my personal comfort is irrelevant. The mission is what matters. They told me there would be trials. They told me the people closest to me would try to stop me. I looked him dead in the eye and I said, who told you that? Did they speak to you in a voice, or was it just a feeling you had? He hesitated. He said, it's a frequency. It's a thought that isn't mine. I said, Marcus, we all have thoughts, that don't feel like ours. We call it an imagination. We call it an inner critic. We call it grief. But when you start giving those thoughts a seat at the table and letting them run your life, you're not a messenger. You're a passenger in your own body, and someone else or something else is driving you right off a cliff. I turned to Sarah. I asked her, what was the exact moment you realized he was gone? She took a deep breath. It was the night of the anniversary of Dad's death, she said. I went over to his house with a pizza and a bottle of wine, thinking we could just sit and remember him. I found Marcus standing in the middle of the backyard with a giant copper rod held over his head. It was lightning out, Phil. A thunderstorm. I was screaming at him to come inside, and he just looked at me with this blank stare. He said, I have to be the antenna, Sarah. If I don't catch the charge, the message will be lost. I had to tackle him to get him inside. He fought me. He called me an agent of the void. That's when I knew. It wasn't just a hobby or a weird interest anymore. He was willing to die for a message that doesn't exist. Marcus tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand. No, Marcus. You've had the floor for 5 years. You've had the floor in that basement, on the internet, and in your own head. Now it's my turn. I'm going to tell you what I see, and I'm going to be Dr. Phil Blunt with you. I see a man who was so devastated by the loss of his father that he couldn't face the silence of that empty house. I see a man who felt like a failure because his career wasn't living up to his father's standards. And I see a man who found a way to be special so he wouldn't have to feel small. These aliens didn't come from the sky, Marcus. They came from a broken heart. You've built an entire galaxy of proof just to avoid one simple, painful truth. Your dad is gone, and you don't know who you are without him. He sat there, and I could see his jaw working. He was fighting the urge to get up and walk out. Most people in his position would. They'd say, you don't know me, you're not a scientist, you're just a TV doctor. But Marcus stayed. And he stayed because deep down in that part of his brain that still knew how to design a bridge, he knew I was talking about the foundation. He knew the dirt was soft. I asked him, Marcus, if I could prove to you right now with 100% certainty that there are no aliens, no frequencies, and no messages, if I could wipe all that away and show you the truth, would you even want to see it? Or are you too afraid of what's left behind? He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. I'm not afraid of the truth, he whispered. I said, yes, you are. You're terrified. Because if there are no aliens, then you're just a 42-year-old man who lost his job, lost his money, and pushed away his sister. That's a lot of loss to carry. It's much easier to be a cosmic pioneer than a man in crisis. But here's the thing. You can't fix a problem you won't admit you have. You're trying to build a skyscraper on a swamp. We have to drain the swamp first. We have to deal with the grief. We have to deal with the identity crisis. We have to deal with the fact that you are lonely, and that's okay. Being lonely is a human condition. It's not a malfunction. Sarah reached out and put her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away this time. It was the first time they'd touched in months. I told him, look at your sister's hand, Marcus. That's a real frequency. That's a real connection. That's a transmission of love that has been trying to reach you for 5 years, but you've had the volume turned down so low you couldn't hear it. You're so worried about being aligned with the stars that you've completely misaligned yourself with the people who actually breathe the same air as you. Is a message from a light year away really more important than the woman sitting next to you who spent her life savings trying to keep you from losing your home? Is that advanced intelligence? Because to me, it looks like a total lack of common sense. I took a deep breath and leaned back in my chair, letting that question hang in the air like a heavy fog. I wanted Marcus to sit with it. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own silence. Because when you strip away the intergalactic signals and the cosmic gates, what you're left with is a man who is profoundly lonely and scared. I looked at the briefcase he was still clutching. I said, Marcus, do me a favor. Open the case. Let's look at the truth together. He hesitated, his knuckles white against the leather handle. He looked at Sarah, then back at me. Slowly, he unlatched the locks. The sound of those clicks echoed in the studio. He pulled out a thick stack of papers. Some were graph paper, some were napkins, some were the backs of old envelopes. All of them were covered in that same frantic, obsessive handwriting. I reached out, and he actually let me take a few pages. I looked at them closely. It wasn't just gibberish. It was a sophisticated, albeit fractured, attempt to map out a system of meaning. I saw words like resonance, oscillation, and harmonic convergence peppered throughout. But then, tucked between 2 pages of equations, I found a photograph. It was an old, Polaroid-style picture of Marcus as a teenager, standing next to his father in front of a half-finished house. They both had tool belts on, and they both had the exact same lopsided grin. I held it up for him to see. Marcus, I said, did the aliens send you this? He looked at the photo, and his whole face softened. No, he said quietly. That was the summer we built the guest house for my aunt. I asked him, why is this in your briefcase of cosmic transmissions? He didn't have a quick answer this time. He stammered for a second, then said, It's a reference point for the geometry. I shook my head. No, it's not, Marcus. It's your heart trying to tell you what you're really looking for. You're not looking for a signal from the stars. You're looking for a signal from your dad. You're looking for him to tell you that you're doing a good job, that he's proud of you, and that you're going to be okay without him. And because he's not here to say it, you've invented a whole species of advanced beings to say it for him. Think about it. They tell you you're chosen. They tell you you're special. They tell you that you have a purpose that no one else understands. Isn't that exactly what a father does for his son? He started to cry then, not a loud, dramatic sob, but those silent, heavy tears that come from a place of deep exhaustion. He looked like a man who had been carrying a mountain on his back for 5 years and had finally been given permission to put it down. Sarah moved her chair closer and wrapped her arm around his shoulders. He didn't resist. He leaned into her. And for the first time in the entire interview, he looked like he was actually present in the room. I told him, Marcus, I want to talk about the title of your story. You told my producers that you felt like no one believed you until you came here. You thought I was going to be the one to validate your aliens. But here's the reality. I don't believe in your aliens, but I do believe in you. I believe your pain is real. I believe your grief is real. And I believe that you are a brilliant man who has lost his way in a very dark forest. I looked at the audience, then back at him. I said, people think that believing someone means agreeing with their delusions. It doesn't. Believing someone means acknowledging their humanity even when they're at their absolute worst. I believe that you believe those aliens are talking to you. I believe that frequency sounds real to you. But I also believe that it's a symptom of a psychological overload. Your brain is like a high-performance engine that's been redlining for 5 years straight because you don't have a cooling system for your emotions. If we don't get you some help, that engine is going to blow. And when it does, there won't be anything left to fix. I turned to Sarah and asked, if Marcus agrees to get professional help, real, intensive, inpatient help where he can safely unpack all this grief and get his feet back on the ground, what are you willing to do? She didn't hesitate. I'll do whatever it takes, Phil, she said. I've already talked to a real estate attorney. If we can get Marcus into treatment, I can help manage the house situation, maybe file for some protection so he doesn't lose everything. I just want my brother back. I don't care about the money. I just want him to be able to look at me and see me, not some agent of the void. I look back at Marcus. The deal is this, buddy. I'm going to provide you with the best resources in the country. I'm going to get you a team of specialists who understand how the brain handles trauma and grief. We're going to look at the hum you're hearing, and we're going to see if there's a neurological component or if it's purely psychological. But you have to agree to one thing. You have to leave the briefcase here. You have to leave the mission behind. You have to commit to living in this world with these people, even if it's boring, even if it's painful, and even if you don't feel special every single minute of the day. Can you do that? Can you choose your sister over the stars? He looked at the briefcase, then at Sarah, then at me. It was the longest 10 seconds I've ever experienced on that stage. You could feel the entire room holding its breath. Finally, he reached out and pushed the briefcase toward the center of the table. I can try, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I said, try is a leak word, Marcus. It gives you an out. I need a will. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and looked me in the eye. I will, he said. That was the breakthrough. But I've been doing this long enough to know that a breakthrough on a stage is just the beginning of a very long, very difficult road. You don't just turn off a delusion like a light switch. It's more like a mourning process. He was going to have to grieve his father all over again, but this time without the alien buffer. He was going to have to face the wreckage of his financial life and his career. He was going to have to learn how to be just Marcus again. And that's a terrifying prospect for someone who has been a cosmic messenger for half a decade. After the show, I went backstage to talk to them one last time. Marcus was sitting on a couch, looking smaller than he had on stage. The energy he'd been vibrating with earlier was gone, replaced by a profound sense of fatigue. I sat down next to him and said, "You did a brave thing today, Marcus. Most people would rather die in their fantasies than live in their reality. You chose life." He looked at me and asked, "Doctor, Phil, what if the hum doesn't go away?" I told him, "Then we'll learn how to treat it like any other background noise. We'll learn how to tune your ears back to the voices of the people who love you. The world is a noisy place, buddy. You just have to decide which sounds are worth listening to." I watched them walk out to the car together. Sarah was holding his hand, and for the first time, Marcus wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at the ground, watching where he was stepping, one foot in front of the other. It wasn't a happily ever after ending. Those don't exist in the real world. But it was a start. It was a solid foundation. And as Marcus's father would have said, if the foundation is right, you've got a chance to build something that lasts. We stayed in touch with Sarah over the following months. The road was rocky. There were moments where Marcus tried to backslide, moments where the signals started to creep back in when things got stressful. But he stayed in treatment. He started working with a grief counselor. He even started doing some freelance drafting work again, real blueprints for real buildings. The most important thing, though, was his relationship with Sarah. They started going to dinner once a week, just the two of them. No copper rods, no frequencies, no intergalactic gates, just a brother and a sister, rediscovering who they were to each other. Marcus eventually told me that the hum hadn't completely disappeared, but it had changed. It didn't sound like a message anymore. It just sounded like life. It sounded like the world turning. And he realized that he didn't need to be chosen to be important. He was important because he was a son, a brother, and a man who had the courage to come back from the edge of the universe to be with the people who mattered most. I want to circle back to something I said on that stage because it's the hardest part for people to hear, especially when they're caught up in a grand fantasy. I told Marcus that being ordinary is okay. To a man who thought he was the chosen liaison for a galactic civilization, being just a guy felt like a death sentence. It felt like he was being demoted from a king to a pauper. But what I've learned is that the most extraordinary thing any of us can do is show up for our own lives, even when they're messy, even when they're quiet, and even when they're hard. Marcus didn't walk out of that studio and immediately become cured. That's not how the human brain works. Delusions are like old, deep-rooted weeds. You can't just pull the top off and expect them not to grow back. You have to get down into the dirt and dig out the roots one by one. Marcus spent 6 months in an intensive residential program. In the beginning, it was brutal. He went through what I call informational withdrawal. He was so used to the constant stimulation of his theories and his data that the quiet of a clinical environment felt like a physical weight. He had moments where he'd look at the ceiling of his room and swear he could see the patterns of the transmission trying to break through. He'd get that itch to reach for a pen and start mapping the alignment, but he had a team around him that didn't just tell him he was wrong, they taught him how to sit with the feelings that the aliens were masking. Every time he felt the urge to go back to his star charts, a counselor would sit him down and say, "Marcus, what's the feeling right now? Are you lonely? Are you missing your father? Are you feeling overwhelmed by the thought of the future?" And slowly, painfully, he started to learn that the frequencies were just his brain's way of sounding an alarm. He was in emotional pain, and his mind had been translating that pain into a cosmic mystery because it was easier to solve a mystery than to fix a broken heart. The financial reality was another mountain to climb. He had essentially set his life on fire. When he finally got out of treatment, he couldn't just go back to his old house. It was gone. He'd lost it to foreclosure. He had to move into a small one-bedroom apartment that Sarah helped him find. It was a far cry from the command center he'd built in his basement. He had to take a job doing basic drafting for a small construction company work that he would have considered beneath him years ago. But I told him, "Marcus, there is dignity in work. There is dignity in being part of a team that builds things people can actually live in. Every line you draw on a page now is a line in the real world." That's a powerful thing. I remember talking to him about a year after the show. He sounded different. His voice was grounded. It had a gravelly human quality to it that I hadn't heard before. He told me, "Doctor, Phil, sometimes I'll be sitting at my desk and I'll hear a hum. Maybe it's the computer or the lights or just the city outside. And for a split second, my brain wants to jump. It wants to say, there it is, they're back." But then I look at the photo of me and my dad on my desk. I look at the coffee cup my sister gave me, and I choose to stay here. That is the definition of maturity. It's not the absence of the impulse, it's the presence of the choice. Marcus had learned that he didn't need to be the most important man in the universe to be a man of value. He was learning to find the extraordinary in the ordinary. He started volunteering at a local community center, teaching kids the basics of geometry and design. He wasn't telling them about aliens, he was telling them about the beauty of a well-constructed bridge. He was passing on the legacy his father gave him, but he was doing it in a way that was healthy and real. Sarah told me that their relationship has reached a place she never thought possible. They go to the movies, they argue about politics, they talk about their father without the conversation devolving into a lecture about cosmic gateways. She said to me, "He's my brother again, Phil. He's not a messenger and he's not a patient. He's just Marcus. And at the end of the day, that's the biggest win there is." We live in a world that is increasingly disconnected, where it's easier than ever to fall down a rabbit hole of conspiracy and fantasy. People are desperate for meaning, and when they don't find it in their communities or their families, they'll look for it in the strangest places. They'll look for it in the stars, or in the static, or in the dark corners of the internet. My job isn't just to fix people, It's to remind them that the most important frequency they can ever tune into is the one coming from the person standing right in front of them. Marcus's story is a reminder that reality is a choice we have to make every single day. It's not always pretty, and it isn't always easy, but it's the only place where you can actually touch someone's hand. It's the only place where a sister's love can reach you. It's the only place where you can build a life that actually stands on a solid foundation. Marcus isn't listening to the stars anymore. He's listening to the world around him. And for the first time in a long time, he likes what he hears. He's home, not in some distant galaxy, but right here, where he belongs.